I stopped believing in happy endings, she whispered. The words did not travel. They stayed close to her mouth, the way small confessions do when a person has carried them a long time and set them down at last on a bench beside a stranger. The bench was cold. The wind off the San Juan Range had the last of March in it, thin and blue and still tasting of snow. Behind them, Durango was going about its Saturday. Wagons creaking, a dog barking near the livery, smoke rising from the boarding house where she had rented a room 3 days ago and meant to leave before the week was out. The man beside her did not answer at once. He did not lift his eyes from the boards at his feet. He simply took off his hat, laid it crown down between them like a small brown island, and slid a 1/4 inch closer along the plank so that his shoulder, without ever touching hers, told her he had heard her and was not going anywhere. She would remember this later as the moment that undid her, though it did not feel like it then. Felt like defeat. Felt like being seen with the dust still on her face. Ethan Calloway was 31 that spring. He stood a shade under 6 feet, lean the way ranch work makes a man lean, with sun-brown forearms and a paler stripe at the collar. His hair was the color of a walnut hull. His eyes a hazel that turned green in strong light and brown in weak. He wore a faded blue chambray shirt, a dark canvas vest, brown wool trousers, and boots resoled twice by an honest man in Pueblo. His hands were the tell, wide across the palm, knuckles heavy, one thumbnail black at the root. He did not smile easily, but when he did, it began at the left corner of his mouth, and it was the only quick thing about him. He had 160 acres 4 miles west of Durango, 32 head, a bay gelding named Toll, an old dog named Sam with 1 blue eye and 1 brown, and a 2-room cabin he had built himself the winter after his brother died. His brother Silas had been thrown from a green colt in September of 1893 and had lived 4 hours after and had not spoken in any of them. Ethan did not talk about that. He talked about fence and weather and the price of oats. The woman on the bench was Clara Whitfield. She was 28. She had come in on the Denver and Rio Grande 3 days earlier with a single trunk and a black dress folded flat beneath the good one, because she did not yet trust the world to let her stop wearing it. She was slim without being frail, dark brown hair pinned beneath a gray felt bonnet, gray eyes quick and tired at once. She wore a high-necked charcoal wool dress that reached the tops of her buttoned boots, long sleeves buttoned at the wrists, a small silver locket at her throat, and a gray shawl she pulled close whenever the wind found her. On the 3rd finger of her left hand was a faint white ring line that had been a ring for 6 years and had not been for 11 months. Ethan had noticed the line on the first afternoon and had said nothing about it, which was, she would later think, the beginning of everything. She had come to Durango because her mother's sister lived there and had written, in the careful hand of a woman who believed in fresh air the way other people believed in God, "Come out. The mountains will not fix you, Clara, but they will not lie to you either." Her husband, Thomas, had died of a fever 11 months earlier in a house in St. Louis with a piano in it and a nursery door she still could not open. Their daughter, who would have been 3 that April, had gone 6 days before him. Clara had not stopped believing in God. She was not brave enough for that. She had only stopped believing in happy endings, which is a different kind of grief, and, she suspected, a more permanent one. She had not meant to say the words out loud. She had come out only to walk. She had ended up on this bench because her legs had told her plainly they were done, and Ethan Calloway had come down the boardwalk with a sack of nails and had, without asking, sat down at the other end of the plank because the wind was mean. He had not spoken. He had only nodded once. The small nod men in that country used to mean "I see you. I mean you no harm, we may share this weather." And she, tired past the habit of privacy, had heard herself whisper the sentence she had not even let herself think in daylight. I stopped believing in happy endings. She waited for him to move away. Men, in her experience, moved away from grief the way they moved away from a rattler in the road. Politely, quickly, without meeting its eye. Ethan did not move. He set his hat between them. He looked at the boards. And after a long moment, in a voice pitched only to her, he said, "That's all right. You don't have to. I'll believe in yours for a while." She turned her head then and looked at him. He was still looking at the boards. He was not looking at her on purpose. because he had learned somewhere that certain words are easier to receive when a person is not being watched while they receive them. She did not answer. She could not. She closed her eyes and breathed in the thin cold air of the San Juans and felt, for the first time in 11 months, that the air was going all the way down. They sat another 20 minutes without speaking. When at last Ethan stood, he set his hat back on his head, touched the brim, and said only, "Ma'am." Then he walked down the boardwalk with the sack of nails over his shoulder, and Clara watched him go, and she did not know his name yet, and she thought, he will not come back. That is how it works. And she was wrong. A woman does not stay a stranger long in a small town. By Monday, Clara knew the man on the bench was Ethan Calloway of the Calloway place 4 miles west. A bachelor, thought well of in a quiet way, who came in Saturdays for supplies and Wednesdays for mail. Her aunt, Miss Harriet Vane, was 71 and considered it her civic duty to hand out biographies of the townspeople the way other women handed out cake. He is, Harriet said, pouring coffee at the kitchen table on Monday morning, the kind of man who is easier to trust than to describe. If you ask a Calloway a question, you get an answer. You might have to wait for it, but you get it. She set the pot down. There are worse things in a man. Clara said nothing. She had not told her aunt about the bench. The second week, the wind eased and the cottonwoods along the Onimus began to show the pale green of first leaf, and Clara began to walk in the mornings, out past the last houses of town where the road turned toward the Calloway place, though she did not know it was the Calloway place. The San Juans did not care that she was a widow. They stood exactly as they had stood the week before, blue and enormous and indifferent, and there was, in their indifference, a mercy she had not found anywhere else. On the 6th morning, she came around a bend in the road and found a man mending a length of split-rail fence that ran along the east side of a wide sloping pasture. He was crouched at the base of a post, driving a new rail with the flat of a heavy mallet, his hat pushed back and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. She recognized the shoulders before she recognized the face. Ethan Calloway looked up, and his mouth did the small left-corner smile she would later learn to watch for, and he said, "Ma'am." She said, "Mr. Calloway." He set the mallet down against the post. He did not stand. "You walk a fair distance." "I did not know it was a distance," she said. "I did not know where the road went. It goes here, and then a little farther, and then it stops at the creek. I have not been to the creek. It is worth seeing. In April especially. There is a stand of cottonwoods along the bend that turns gold in the fall and green now. Sam will show you if he likes you. He generally likes women better than men, which is one of the several things he has been right about." At his name, the old blue and brown-eyed dog appeared from somewhere behind the fence and came out and sat at Clara's boot without ceremony. And she laughed once, a small startled laugh, and Ethan Calloway ducked his head as if he had not heard it, but she saw the corner of his mouth. She walked on to the creek and sat by the water for an hour. When she walked back, he was still at the fence, but he had moved 40 feet down the line, and there was a new stretch of rail bright against the weathered gray of the old ones. He nodded as she passed. He did not speak. She did not either. There was no need. That evening, at Harriet's kitchen table, Clara said, without looking up from her plate, "I met Mr. Calloway on the road." Harriet, who was buttering a biscuit with the patience of a woman who had been waiting a week for a piece of news, said, "Did you?" It was not a question. "Clara, there is a thing about Ethan Calloway you should know. He does not say things. He does things. If a Calloway says he will fix your gate, you will find your gate fixed. If a woman is in his mind, she will not hear about it for a while. She will only find her would split. It is a slow language, but it is not a lying one." Clara sat with that a long time. Then she said, "I am not looking for a language. I know you are not. I only wanted you to have the grammar of the one you are already inside of." That night she lay awake in the narrow room at the back of Harriet's house and thought, for the first time since Thomas, about the small warm space between two shoulders on a cold bench, and she did not cry, and she did not sleep for a long time either. The third week, the wagon wheel on Harriet's little buckboard cracked at the rim on the road out to the mercantile. Before Harriet could send the boy with a note to the smith, Ethan Calloway came down the road on his bay leading a second horse harnessed to a stone boat, dismounted at the gate, touched his hat, and said, "Miss Vane, I heard about your wheel. I have not sent the boy yet. No, ma'am. The boy told the smith's boy at the pump, and the smith's boy told me at the feed store, and I was already coming to town. I have a spare rim at the place that will fit. If you will let me take the wheel, I will have it back to you by Wednesday. Ethan Calloway, you do not owe me a wheel. No, ma'am. I do not. He waited. Harriet let him take the wheel. He came back Wednesday with it and set it in place in an hour, working slowly and neatly, and when he was done he pushed his hat off his forehead with the back of his wrist and said, "That will hold." Clara was on the porch. She had come out with a cup of coffee an hour into the work and had watched him without meaning to. When he was done, he came up to the porch to touch the brim of his hat to Harriet, and Clara held out the cup and said, "It has gone cold." He took it. He drank it anyway. He said, "It is not cold if you are thirsty." Harriet, from the doorway, said, "Ethan, will you stay for supper?" "I will not, ma'am. Toll has thrown a shoe and I want to get him home before dark." Another time, he touched his hat and went down the steps and mounted the bay and rode out, and Clara stood on the porch a long time watching the road empty behind him, and she thought he fixed the wheel. He did not need to fix the wheel. He fixed it anyway. She felt, low down in her chest, the first thin crack in the belief she had brought with her from St. Louis, the belief that nothing more would ever be given to her that she had not paid for twice. Harriet, behind her, said, "That is what love looks like when it does not announce itself. It just quietly fixes the wheel." Clara did not turn around. She said, "Aunt Harriet, I am only telling you the grammar." In the fourth week the town began, in its way, to notice. A town like Durango has its own chorus, and Durango's chorus that spring was four voices in particular: Harriet Vane, Mrs. Alma Reeves at the Mercantile, who could weigh a pound of flour and a piece of gossip in the same breath and never confuse them; the Reverend Josiah Pike, 64, who had married more people than he had buried; and Nate Doolin, the 16-year-old boy who swept the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile and heard everything and understood most of it. These four, without ever meeting to discuss the matter, arrived by the end of April at the same private conclusion, which was that Ethan Calloway had begun to come to town on Tuesdays. Ethan Calloway did not come to town on Tuesdays. Ethan Calloway came to town on Saturdays for supplies and on Wednesdays for mail. That he now also came on Tuesdays with no visible errand, by way of the road that ran past Harriet Vane's front gate, was, in Alma Reeves's phrase, a development. "Not a Tuesday," Alma said to Harriet on the first Tuesday, watching through the Mercantile window as Ethan rode past at a walk. "Which I noticed." "I noticed also," said Harriet. "He is looking at the porch, if we are being accurate." They said nothing to Clara. This was policy. The chorus of Durango had learned, over a long collective lifetime, that a courtship watched too openly is a courtship strangled, and they had decided to let this one breathe. Clara noticed on her own. By the third Tuesday, she had begun to find herself on the porch at 4 with a book she was not reading. By the fourth Tuesday, Ethan had stopped his horse at the gate and had spoken to her about the weather for 4 minutes and had ridden on. By the fifth Tuesday, he had come up the walk and sat on the second step of the porch and had stayed nearly an hour, mending, without asking, a loose plank in Harriet's front step with a hammer and 3 nails. He took out of his vest pocket like a man who had been carrying them there against exactly this occasion. When he was gone, Harriet said, "He brought his own nails, Clara." "I saw. A man who brings his own nails has been thinking about a step for some time." Clara said nothing, but she went inside and stood a long moment at the kitchen window looking east, and she said softly to no one, "I stopped believing in happy endings." It came out of her differently this time, not as a stone laid down, but as a stone being turned over, examined, and found lighter than she remembered. By the 6th week, Ethan Calloway was, in the language of the country, calling on Mrs. Whitfield, and the whole town knew it, and no one had said the word aloud, and it was going, in Reverend Pike's private phrase, about as well as such a thing could go. Then Caleb Merriweather came back to Durango. Caleb Merriweather was 34, a lawyer out of Denver, tall and handsome in the clean-shaven way of city men, with sandy hair kept short and a gray wool suit cut well. He had grown up in Durango and had, 7 years earlier in a St. Louis parlor at a cousin's wedding, met Clara Whitfield when she was not yet Clara Whitfield, when she was Clara Ashcroft, 21 years old and not yet promised to anyone. He had, in the mild way of a young man who has not yet learned to press, thought about her afterward. He had written her one letter. She had married Thomas Whitfield 3 months later. That Caleb Merriweather had believed for 7 years was that he came to Durango in the first week of May to settle an estate for a client. He learned from the desk clerk at the hotel that Miss Harriet Vane's widowed niece was living with her. He sat a long moment at the desk. Then he went, that same afternoon, to Harriet Vane's front gate with his hat in his hand. Clara was on the porch. She was mending, of all things, a small tear in the pocket of one of Ethan Calloway's spare shirts, which he had left behind 3 days ago after helping repair the shutter on the east window and which Harriet had, with the smooth casualness of a woman committing a small conspiracy, handed to Clara that morning since it is needing a stitch and you have the light. Caleb came up the walk and stopped at the foot of the steps. Mrs. Whitfield. Clara looked up. She did not know him at first. When she did, she set the shirt down carefully on the arm of the porch chair, and stood and said, "Mr. Merriweather, you remember?" "I remember," he said quietly and without pressing. "I was very sorry to hear about your husband. I did not know until this morning." "Thank you. May I sit?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Yes." He sat on the second step of the porch, one step below the one Ethan Calloway sat on when he sat on the porch, and he was, Clara realized as he began to talk, a very kind man. He did not press. He did not ask her about her grief. He spoke about the town, about the changes since he had last been there, about his mother who still lived in the yellow house near the church. Before he left, he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I would like, if you will permit me, to call again. I am in town through the middle of June. I do not wish to intrude. I only wish to say that I have not stopped thinking, in the last 7 years, that I ought to have written a second letter." Clara looked at him a long moment. She said at last, "You may call Mr. Merriweather. I make no promises beyond that. I ask for none." He touched his hat. He went down the walk. Clara sat back down on the porch chair. She picked up Ethan Calloway's shirt. She did not, for a long time, resume the mending. The following Tuesday, Ethan came to the gate at his usual hour. He did not come up the walk. He sat his horse a moment, and he looked at the porch, and Clara was on the porch, and behind her through the open door of the parlor she could be seen. She knew she could be seen, from the road, sitting at the little writing table where Caleb Merriweather had left, that morning, a small pressed flower and a card. Ethan Calloway looked once. He touched his hat. And he rode on. He did not stop the next Tuesday either. Or the one after. Clara said nothing about it to Harriet. Harriet, for the first time in Clara's memory, said nothing back. The chorus of Durango went quiet. Alma stopped saying not a Tuesday. Nate swept his boardwalk with the vague grim air of a boy watching a good thing fall apart from a great distance. By the middle of May, Caleb Merriweather had called 4 times. He had, on the 4th call, said gently that he would be returning to Denver on the 15th of June and would be glad, if Clara wished, to escort her east on the same train. He would consider it, he said, an honor. Clara said, "I will think about it, Mr. Merriweather. I owe you an answer. I will give it before the 15th. Take the time you need." She took a week. At the end of the week she went walking, out past the last houses of town, on the road that ran west toward the creek. She did not think, going out, that she meant to walk as far as the Calloway place. She thought only that she meant to walk until she could breathe. But her feet had been walking this road for 6 weeks, and they knew where they were going, and by 4 in the afternoon she was standing at the split-rail fence at the east edge of Ethan Calloway's pasture, and Ethan Calloway was 15 feet away on the far side of the rail, driving a nail into a new gate that had not been there the last time she had passed. He looked up. He set the hammer down. He straightened, slowly, and took off his hat, and held it against his chest with both hands. She said, "Mr. Calloway." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." The wind came down from the mountains and moved the tops of the cottonwoods, which were, this week, fully out and heavy and bright green. She said, "You stopped coming on Tuesdays." "I did." He looked at his hat. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I am not a lawyer from Denver. I did not know you when you were 21. I have 32 head of cattle and a 2-room cabin and a dog who prefers women. I did not want to be a thing you had to choose against a better thing. I did not know how to be and stay in the road." She stood at the fence a long time. She said, "Mr. Calloway." The east window of my aunt's house faces the mountains. He looked up. I noticed, the morning after you fixed the shutter, that the window had been rebuilt. Not only mended, rebuilt. It is a wider window than it was. It lets in the light from the east now, which it did not before. My aunt did not ask you to rebuild it. No, ma'am, she did not. Why did you? He was quiet a while. He said, because you sit at that table in the mornings. And because the mornings out here are the best part of the day. And because I thought, if I could not sit beside you every morning, I could at least give you the light. The wind moved. A single cottonwood leaf came loose above them and turned once in the air and fell between them on the top rail of the fence. She said very quietly, I told you on a bench in March that I stopped believing in happy endings. I remember. I want to tell you, she said, and her voice was even but her eyes were bright, that I did not stop. I only put it down for a while. I have been trying, these past weeks, to pick it up again. It is heavier than I remembered. I do not know if I can carry it alone. He said, you will not have to. Mr. Calloway. Ethan. Ethan. She reached across the top rail of the fence with her ungloved hand, and he reached with his, and they did not touch beyond the fingers, but the fingers stayed a long time, and the cottonwood leaf lay on the rail between them, and Sam the old dog watched from 10 feet away and did not move. She said, I am not going back to Denver on the 15th. No, ma'am. I will tell Mr. Merriweather tomorrow. He is a good man. He deserves a plain answer. He does. I have been trying to remember that for 2 weeks. She almost smiled. You have not been very good at it. No, ma'am. I have not. They stood at the fence another quarter hour without speaking. When she turned to walk back, he walked with her along his side of the rail until the fence ended at the road, and then he stopped because he had built the fence himself and knew where it ended, and she went on alone, and she did not look back until she was at the last bend, and when she did he was still standing where the fence ended with his hat in his hands. The next afternoon, Clara went to the yellow house near the church and sat with Caleb Merriweather in his mother's parlor, and she said what she had come to say. She said it gently because he had been gentle and plainly because he deserved a plain answer. Mr. Merriweather, you have been a kindness in a hard year. I owe you the truth. There is a man here. It is not, I think, the kind of thing I could carry to Denver and expect to keep. I am staying. Caleb Merriweather did not answer at once. He set his teacup down. He looked at the window a long moment. He said, Mrs. Whitfield, may I say one thing and then I will say no more? Yes. I have been a man who wrote one letter 7 years ago and did not write the second. I have thought about that letter on and off for those 7 years. When I came to Durango and heard your name, I told myself I had come to write the second at last. I want you to know, so that you will not carry this lightly and so that I will not carry it lightly either, that I am not sorry I came. I am only sorry I did not write the second letter in 1899. A man who does not speak in time forfeits the right to be answered later. Mr. Merriweather, please, let me finish. I will not press you. I will only ask you one thing, and you may refuse it without offense. The man you are staying for, is he a man who will build you a wider window? She said he already did. Caleb Merriweather closed his eyes a moment. Then he opened them and he smiled. A real smile, tired and clean. And he said, then I have no argument. A man who has already built the window has answered the question I meant to spend 6 months asking. Mrs. Whitfield, I wish you every good thing. I mean that. He stood. He touched his hat. He said, I will still be on the 15th train. I would take it kindly if you would send my regards to your aunt. One more thing. Do not ever apologize to him for having been sad. A man who fixes a shutter without being asked has already made his peace with your winters. He left. They were married on the second Saturday in June, in the small stone church at the north end of Durango, with the doors open to the wind and the cottonwoods out and the San Juans blue and enormous behind. Clara wore a high-necked ivory wool dress that Harriet had helped her sew, long sleeves buttoned at the wrists, a plain lace collar, and the silver locket at her throat. Ethan wore a clean chambray shirt, a black wool coat that had been his brother Silas's, and boots resoled a third time by the honest man in Pueblo. Reverend Pike read the words plainly and did not embellish, because he knew the couple and knew that they had done the embellishing themselves already. Alma Reeves cried once and then pretended she had not. Nate Doolin held the door. Harriet Vane, who had been to more weddings than she had teeth, sat in the second pew and did not, this once, hand out a single biography to anyone. That night, at the cabin 4 miles west of town, Ethan carried Clara's trunk in from the wagon and set it at the foot of the bed and stood a moment in the doorway of the second room. The small one he had, over the last 3 weeks, quietly widened. There was a new window in the east wall. It was wider than any window in the cabin had a right to be. It faced the mountains. The last of the evening light was coming through it in a slow gold slab across the pine floor. Clara stood in the light. She said, "Ethan." "Yes." "You built another one." "I did. For the mornings." "For the mornings." She stood in the gold light a long time. She did not cry. She did not need to. She said, "I have been thinking about what I said on the bench. I stopped believing in happy endings. And then I sat beside a man who did not move away. And I have been, ever since, learning to believe again. Not in the ending. I am not sure I will ever believe in the ending. I have decided I do not have to. I have decided I only have to believe in the sitting beside. That is enough of a happy ending for me." He crossed the room. He did not, even then, hurry. He put his hands on the sides of her face, gently, the way a man puts his hands on a thing he has been given and does not deserve and will spend his life earning. He said, into the small quiet space between them, "Then that is the ending I will build." They stood a long time in the east window's light. Outside, the cottonwoods moved. Sam the old dog lay down on the porch. The San Juans held the last of the light, and then, slowly, gave it up. In the town 4 miles east, Harriet Vane sat on her own porch with a cup of tea and looked west toward the mountains and said, aloud, to no one in particular, "That is what love looks like when it does not announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Grief does not leave. It only learns to share the house with other things. That is the true happy ending, the one that does not depend on the ending at all. It depends on the sitting beside. It depends on the wider window. It depends on the fence that gets mended without being asked, and the wheel that gets fixed without being owed, and the bench that does not move away when a woman finally says the sentence she has been carrying alone. If you have been carrying such a sentence, the one you have not let yourself say in daylight, I hope you find, this week, a bench that does not move. I hope you find a person who does not answer your grief with a speech, but with the small slide of a shoulder, and a hat set down between you like a small brown island, and a voice that says, that's all right. You don't have to. I'll believe in yours for a while. I hope, when you say the second half of your sentence at last, there is someone in an east-facing doorway who has already built the room to hear it in. Thank you, from my end of the bench to yours, for sitting a while with Clara and Ethan today. Until next time, keep riding. If Clara and Ethan's story stayed with you, keep the bench warm. There is another one waiting. Next, on Frontier Hearts. An old rancher in the San Juans keeps a lantern lit in the west window every night, and when a woman he has not seen in 20 years finally rides up the road and asks him why, he tells her, because I always thought you'd come back at dark. Ride with us for that one, too.